He drives past his old house just to look at it and never tells anyone. There is a particular detour that many men take without ever quite admitting it's a detour at all, a slight deviation from the most direct route home, an extra few minutes added to an errand that didn't require them, all so he can drive past a house that hasn't belonged to him in years, sometimes decades. He slows down as he approaches it. He doesn't stop usually. He simply looks, taking in whatever has changed and whatever, remarkably, hasn't, before continuing on as though nothing happened at all. He has never once mentioned this ritual to his wife, his children, or anyone else who might ask why this particular street seems to appear so often in his casual errands. The wise observer has come to recognize this pattern as one of the more quietly poignant habits carried by men of this generation, a private ritual of remembrance that exists entirely outside the boundaries of normal conversation. This isn't nostalgia in the shallow, easily articulated sense people usually mean when they use that word. It's something closer to an unfinished conversation with his own past, conducted silently, repeatedly, through the simple act of looking at a house that no longer has any claim on him except the one he continues, quietly, to grant it. To understand this particular ritual, the wise observer must consider what that house actually represents beyond its physical structure. For many men, it isn't simply the building itself that matters, but everything the building once contained: a childhood spent within its walls, a marriage that began there, children raised inside rooms now occupied by strangers, a version of himself that existed only within that specific address and nowhere else. Driving past isn't really about the house. It's about visiting a version of his own life that technically no longer exists anywhere except in memory, using the physical structure as a kind of anchor point for feelings he has no other reliable way to access. Consider the specific houses that tend to draw men back most consistently. Sometimes it's a childhood home, the one his parents eventually sold after he'd already grown and moved away, carrying memories of a family structure and a version of safety that existed before adulthood introduced its own complications. Sometimes it's a first marital home, the modest starter house where he and his wife built the earliest version of their life together before children, before larger homes, before the accumulated weight of decades reshaped who they'd become. Sometimes, more painfully, it's a house connected to a marriage that ended, a family that dissolved, a version of fatherhood that got interrupted or complicated in ways he's never fully processed with anyone. The wise observer wants to name something important here. This ritual persists specifically because it offers something conversation cannot. Talking about loss, about the passage of time, about the specific ache of watching a meaningful chapter of his life become permanently inaccessible requires a vocabulary many men of this generation were never given. But looking, simply looking, at a physical space that once held all of that meaning requires no vocabulary at all. It's a wordless form of grief processing, private and self-contained, that doesn't demand he articulate anything he isn't yet ready or able to say aloud. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this pattern with real emotional clarity. He's driving home from an unremarkable errand, nothing about the day particularly significant, and finds himself, almost without conscious decision, turning onto a street that adds several unnecessary minutes to his route. As the house comes into view, something in his posture shifts, subtle but real, a slight straightening, a quieting of whatever he was thinking about moments before. He slows the car to something just above a crawl, taking in the new paint color, the tree that's grown considerably since he last really looked at it, the child's bicycle in the driveway that belongs to a family he's never met. Then, just as quietly as he arrived, he continues on, the moment closed as privately as it opened. This pattern often intensifies specifically around significant life transitions, functioning almost like an emotional check-in point during periods of change. Men approaching retirement, men whose own children are leaving home, men recently widowed or divorced, often describe an increased frequency to these drive-bys, as though revisiting a stable, remembered past becomes more necessary precisely during moments when the present feels newly uncertain or unmoored. The old house, unchanging in memory even as it changes physically, offers a kind of psychological anchor during periods when everything else feels like it's shifting beneath him. It's worth examining how this ritual differs significantly depending on the specific emotional history attached to the house in question. A drive past a happy childhood home often carries warmth, a gentle wistfulness mixed with genuine gratitude for what that place once provided. A drive past a house connected to a difficult divorce or a family rupture carries something far more complicated: grief, tangled with regret, sometimes anger, sometimes a longing for a version of events that could have unfolded differently. The physical ritual looks identical from the outside in both cases. The internal experience, the wise observer suspects, could not be more different. The wise observer wants to point out something particularly tender about why this ritual so rarely gets shared with anyone, even a spouse who might genuinely want to understand this part of him. Admitting to this habit requires acknowledging a persistent emotional attachment to a past life, sometimes a past family, in ways that can feel, to him, like an implicit betrayal of his current life and relationships, even when no actual betrayal is occurring. A man revisiting the house where his first marriage began, decades into a second, genuinely happy marriage, often fears that mentioning this habit would be misread as longing for something other than what he currently has, rather than what it actually represents: simple, uncomplicated grief for a chapter of his life that ended, regardless of how his current life has turned out. There's a specific complexity worth naming in how this pattern shows up for men whose old homes have been demolished or significantly altered beyond recognition. Rather than resolving the ritual, this transformation often intensifies the underlying grief, because the physical anchor for memory has itself become inaccessible, leaving him staring at something that no longer even resembles the place he's actually trying to reconnect with. Some men describe a specific, disorienting sadness upon discovering a childhood home demolished for new construction, a loss layered on top of loss, grieving not just the original chapter of life, but now also the physical evidence that chapter ever existed at all. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how this pattern occasionally evolves into something more direct when circumstances allow. Some men, usually decades after the fact, work up the courage to actually knock on the door of a former home, introducing themselves to current owners and asking, somewhat sheepishly, whether they might see inside for just a few minutes. These encounters, when they happen, often produce profound emotional responses that surprise even the man experiencing them. A flood of specific sensory memory triggered by standing in a room that looks nothing like it once did, yet somehow still carries traces of exactly who he used to be within it. It's worth naming, too, how this ritual intersects with his relationship to his own children, particularly as they grow into adulthood and begin forming memories of their own childhood homes. Watching his own kids develop the same kind of attachment to houses he's since sold or moved away from can produce a specific, bittersweet recognition, an understanding that he's now become the source of exactly the kind of nostalgic pull he himself has always privately carried toward his own past homes, a quiet continuation of the same emotional pattern passed forward into the next generation without either party fully realizing the connection. There's a particular irony worth naming in how meticulously private this ritual remains, even for men who are otherwise quite open about ordinary nostalgia. He'll happily tell stories about his childhood, share old photographs, reminisce openly at family gatherings about people and places from decades past. The drive-by itself, though, remains categorically different from these more socially acceptable forms of remembering, precisely because it involves an ongoing, active behavior rather than simple storytelling about the past. Telling a story about an old house implies the past is safely contained in memory. Actually driving there, repeatedly, implies something less resolved, an ongoing relationship with that place that feels, to him, too raw or too complicated to fully explain, even to people who would likely understand. It's worth examining how this pattern shows up in relation to houses connected to parents who have since passed away. A man whose childhood home was sold decades before his parents' deaths often finds the ritual intensifying in the years immediately following their passing, as though the house becomes, in the absence of the actual people who once lived there, the closest remaining physical connection to a version of family life that otherwise exists only in memory. Driving past becomes something closer to visiting a grave, a place to feel connected to people no longer present anywhere else in his world. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how this ritual sometimes gets discovered by accident by the people who love him most. His adult daughter, running an errand of her own, spots his car slowed to a crawl outside a house she vaguely recognizes from old family photographs, parked at an angle suggesting he's been there for several minutes. She doesn't mention it immediately, eventually finding a gentle way to ask weeks later, genuinely curious rather than concerned. The wise observer wants to point out something important about how this pattern intersects with his broader relationship to change itself. Many men from this generation, as discussed elsewhere, struggle significantly with transitions, with endings, with the particular discomfort of watching chapters of life close permanently without any ceremony marking their conclusion. The old house drive-by functions, in some sense, as a self-invented ritual, filling exactly that gap, an informal, private ceremony of remembrance for life chapters that ended without any formal acknowledgement at the time they actually concluded. Where other cultures and eras provided more structured rituals for marking transitions and losses, he's quietly invented his own, conducted alone, in a slow-moving car, without anyone ever teaching him this was an option available to him. It's worth noting, too, how this ritual sometimes extends beyond residential homes to other meaningful locations, a demolished workplace where he spent decades of his career, a closed restaurant where he had his first date with his wife, a torn-down school that once held his entire adolescent social world. The pattern remains consistent across these variations, a private, wordless visitation to spaces that once contained significant chapters of identity, conducted quietly and almost never disclosed to anyone else navigating the same roads alongside him. There's a tender complexity worth naming in how this ritual sometimes shifts once he finally does share it with someone close to him, often producing a result quite different from what he feared. Rather than the confusion or concern he anticipated, many men describe genuine surprise at how readily their spouse or adult children understand and even relate to the impulse, sometimes revealing their own private version of the exact same habit directed at entirely different locations. This shared vulnerability, once finally spoken aloud, often becomes a genuine point of connection rather than the source of misunderstanding he'd quietly worried it might be for years. There's one final observation worth naming, because it captures something genuinely hopeful about this otherwise quietly melancholic pattern. Men who eventually do share this ritual with someone close to them often describe a specific, unexpected outcome, an invitation to actually revisit the location together rather than continuing the drive-by alone. A wife suggesting they park properly and simply sit for a few minutes, an adult child offering to accompany him on what he'd always treated as a solitary pilgrimage, transforms a private, wordless grief ritual into something shared, something that no longer has to be carried entirely alone. There is real tenderness worth ending on, though. This private ritual, however unspoken, represents something genuinely valuable rather than something to be dismissed as simple sentimentality. It's evidence of a man who remains capable of deep, sustained emotional connection to the people and places that shaped him, even decades after circumstances moved him elsewhere. The silence surrounding the ritual isn't emptiness. It's simply the particular shape his grief and gratitude have learned to take, conducted in the privacy of a slow-moving car rather than in words he's never quite found the confidence to speak aloud. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you love a man who takes unexplained detours, who occasionally arrives home a few minutes later than an errand should have required, understand that he may be carrying on a private, wordless conversation with a version of his own life that continues to matter to him, regardless of how much time has passed. The kindest response isn't demanding an explanation he may not yet have words for, but simply making clear, gently, and repeatedly, that whatever he's carrying from that old house would be welcome to finally come inside the home he's living in now.